But this is due to a complex problem that I work on behind the scenes, because that's where the problem is. The problem is within Majestic, and the problem is within conventional political leaders and the military-industrial complex. And when we started this effort, I had about a third of this Majestic group who thought what we were doing was something they would support. Now it's 70%. Now the other 30% would probably like to see me dead. But the point is, and they're vicious, but there's 70% of them now who really are lining up, and this includes the elements within Majestic that are in Europe, that are within the Masonics, that are within a lot of secret organizations that are fed up with the secrecy and know that we're at the end of how far we can take this silly game of secrecy and secret power. And so a lot of what the work that I've been doing, and it has directly to do with disclosure, has to do with trying to fix that highly dysfunctional dynamic, which cannot be ignored. You cannot pretend like those lions aren't out lurking in the jungle. You don't have to capitulate, but you have to try to educate them and give them another vision. And one thing I say to people is that people who are addicted to secret power, Kissinger once said, power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. Yeah. Then the secret power would be that on steroids and Viagra and every other thing, to be quite blunt. And so one of the real issues becomes what can you can't just take away, you have to give. And so here my job is to try to also give some of these leaders, and both conventional leaders and people who are within these classified projects, a new vision. A vision that can guide the world out of its current direction into a path of peace, safety, justice, free energy, and a whole new transformation of our civilization on this planet very quickly, because we've run out of time, in my opinion. I don't think we have another 50 or 100 years to fritter away.
Well, as it happens, neither do they. I mean, what we get from our secret witnesses and from people that are, exposed to the Illuminati philosophy constantly is that our time is running out in terms of, like, we just heard from a secret witness, and I'm running this by you to hear whether this coincides with what you know, that there is around 10 months left of food before it runs out on the planet, and that there's another 3 to 4 years worth of oxygen. I mean, I don't know if this is down to the minute or not, or whether this is it's more vague than it was stated to me, or more in where you would fall in that category in terms of how you understand that.
Let me say that there are a lot of my father-in-law used to famously say, paper does not refuse ink. And in the modern era, the computer screen does not refuse digits. So in other words, anything can be said. Now, one has to, my own assessment of that is that there are competing interests that try to use whatever access they have to provide a certain paradigm that is highly eschatological. The eschatological axis within Majestic is a very powerful one. And when I remember meeting with a member of a royal family in Europe back in the 90s, and his entire purpose in providing funding to abduction researchers was to, and I know who they are, all the mainline ones, was so that they would put the information out to the public so that the public would learn to hate enough of the aliens so that we could have an interplanetary war, which would be the Armageddon, that would precipitate the return of Christ. Now, this was a very specific, Opus Dei perspective, and that is really what is driving. It's like Ahmadinejad in Iran saying that, well, it'd be okay if we went to nuclear war with Israel, because that would force the 12th Imam, which is their return of their Christ, to return to Iran.
Sure.
And so this eschatological end of the world perspective.
So you're actually saying, just to cut to the chase here, you're saying that this man's testimony to what I just said about 10 months and 4 years is basically him being programmed by the controllers in a certain sense.
Well, it's through a glass dimly. In other words, yes, we're headed for a crisis. yes, we're headed towards a hiatus, can I call it that, in the situation. But what they don't understand is that it is the end of one era and the opening of another. It isn't the end of life on Earth. It is not going to be the end of the human race on this planet.
Well,
These
we
are all.
certainly
This
agree
is
with that.
this is so the conflation of certain misinterpreted spiritual traditions, whether it's in the Book of Revelations or elsewhere, or the Mayan calendar in 2012, has created this sort of eschatological juggernaut,
Sure.
which is very Scientological. It's very majestic, and it has a lot of underpinnings within the philosophy of why the secrecy has continued on like it is. This is one major axis of why the secrecy has continued. The other one is the technological and money and control and macroeconomic control of the planet.
Yeah.
My point to people is that, for example, now I've been doing this for 19 years, and I've had, you know, if you brief the CIA director, you've had some good access, and that was
Sure.
16 years ago. And my family put the first man on the moon. So I have had access to people within classified projects for a lot of my life. And for example, and I know that we're going to probably disagree on this because I saw what you wrote on your blog after my talk last night. There are people who have been exposed to what they wanted them to see. This Bob Lazar was one that they then allow to speak out. Now the question is, what's the agenda behind that allowing? I have had more than a dozen people who have worked in facilities in Dulce and in Pine Gap in Australia, and other places where they have actually been growing the gray and reptilian species that people think are ETs. And that the people who've been in the projects think they're working alongside an alien. And they're not. They're absolutely what are called nano-biomachines. And they are programmed life forms. And there is no question that that is going on. And so the larger question becomes, if someone comes up to you with just an empirical observation, what is it they're seeing? Now I'm going to cross over into something even more controversial. We have some people at Lockheed and another program, I can't say where it is, but it's in the south, in an underground facility, and the chief scientist is someone I know very well. And they have developed electromagnetic systems where they can put someone into a state and they can go into, and this gets into a cosmological complex discussion now, a lower astral or denser astral field. And some would call this demonic. And they can actually see beings and creatures there and bring them in three-dimensional and materialize in flesh and blood through these electronics. So a lot of these things that people are seeing have nothing to do with interstellar and extraterrestrial. So when I talk about the interstellar civilizations that also have trans-dimensional capability. You can't go through interstellar space at the speed of light or less.
Right.
But there's a cosmological indigestion happening within ufology and disclosure that I find disturbing, because people are conflating interdimensional with extraterrestrial with PLFs that are programmed life forms, man-made, and all of this is being put together as if it is one thing, and it isn't. It's unfortunately much more complex than this, and this is exactly why.
We agree with that as well. It's very complex.
This is why when Martin Cannon, back in the late 80s, put together a 2,000 footnoted paper and collection proving the military human involvement with abductions, and that the creatures they were using were not ET. There wasn't some alliance between Majestic and these ETs. The ETs wouldn't bother with them. Now I say they're aliens, but they're not extraterrestrials. Okay, and now we're getting into, and people say I'm being cheeky. I'm not, because these are very bizarre creatures, and some of them even, I'm going to take it one step further. You've all heard of Roswell. And you've all heard of that there have been a number of electromagnetic weapon systems that have targeted and knocked down interstellar vehicles, not at a great kill rate in the early days. I hate to use the word kill rate, it's terrible, but it's become more and more efficient since SDI and since the 90s, frankly, and particularly in the last 5 or 10 years. What happened, however, in the early days, they had enough crude stuff. Of course, we had things like the Philadelphia experiment, which did not happen in Philadelphia. It happened in Rhode Island. That was the cover story. That's another whole discussion. But that was in the 40s. And so there were very advanced electronics that were already being used. And by the